In this lecture, we will survey the theoretical background for Ferdinand de Saussure's course in general linguistics, Northrop Frye's The Archetypes of Literature, Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author, Michel Foucault's What is an Author, and Jean-François Lyotard's Defining the Postmodern. Formalism focuses on form, plot, metaphor, irony, genre, and so forth, anything that can fall within the categories of literary form and literary device. Formalists believe that the purpose of literature is to make life lifier, to bring into focus that which we overlook every day, to refresh and sharpen our perspectives for life so that we see and feel acutely that which otherwise has become familiar and dull. New criticism is America's original school of formalism. New critics believe that nothing exists outside the text. They perform close readings of the text's literary devices and forms without historical or biographical context because the text is the ends rather than the means, rather than examine literature in order to study the messages, ideologies, and impacts of political parties, historical events, and cultural values, rather than let the literature be overrun by these voices. New criticism claims neutrality outside of the social and political values, to truly look at the literature, to see it, rather than through it. Structuralism is an extension of formalism. It makes a novel argument not to examine literature as a product or message of beauty, truth, or power, but as a grammar. A grammar of what? Well, that's perhaps a more difficult question to answer. Structuralism came about in the early 20th century, right at the moment when all disciplines and discourses were undergoing a scientivizing effect. We see this superficially in the mass production of art, which resulted in the schism between high and low modernism at that time, or art that is crafted by an elite person of vision versus popular art that is made, perhaps even mass-produced, for the lowest common denominator, for the masses. Industrialism was both a cause and effect on the ways people began shifting their values away from the Renaissance humanist ideals of beauty, truth, and goodness, believing that art had a higher meaning and noble purpose, towards instead the modern values that reflected an increasingly commodified society. For instance, today you are no longer valued for how good of a job you do, but rather how much money you generate. Industrialism also impacted the shape of our class system, engorging our middle class, while the sciences, as the agency propelling industrialism, jettisoned towards the top of our educational systems as the most pragmatic and desirable knowledge for a people. As we've discussed in class, the modern period is one which relied increasingly upon the sciences to accomplish utopian dreams, to propel humanity upwards and forwards in linear progressive fashion. We've talked, too, about how the world wars changed this perspective of the sciences. But before we get there, we have a trend in many disciplines to scientivize themselves. The assumption is that science provides a codified methodology and theory that perspicaciously pierces into the messiness of biology, geology, physics, psychology, life in general, to provide the objective laws that govern each field. It might be worthwhile to note that this impulse to discover the driving mechanisms of the world is not new, but in the pre-modern age all questions were answered spiritually. All things could be explained through God. So now, in the early 20th century, when science promises other ways of answering our largest questions, various disciplines sought to discover their own scientific infrastructure. For literature, this endeavor manifested through structuralism. As we said earlier, structuralism looks for the grammar of things, the rules that govern our systems of meaning that are constant across culture and time. A good place to start when looking at structuralism is semiotics, because structuralists, like Ferdinand de Saussure, argue that the most totalizing, coherent, and comprehensive grammar that we have for making meaning is language, and semiology is a structuralist means of studying language. Semiotics is the study of signs and symbols. Now you'll read about this in Saussure, but to give a basic introduction here, a sign is made of a signified and a signifier. The signified is the concept you're trying to represent. The signifier is the form you use to represent that concept. And the sign is the combination of signified and signifier. So, for instance, if you had an apple in your house and you wanted to refer to it, The idea of that apple is your signified. The word apple, whether written or uttered, is your signifier, and the sign is this union of concept and form. Obviously, language can be more complicated than this. So for instance, if I wanted to represent the idea of knowledge through the word apple, then the idea of knowledge becomes the signified, while the word or already constructed sign apple becomes the signifier. So a sign becomes a signifier of another sign. We might call this a symbol, especially because it is a sign that does not resemble what it's trying to represent. If a sign does resemble what it's trying to represent, it's called an icon. You see this kind of sign in the Chinese alphabet where letters resemble the things, water, trees, mountain, etc., that they're trying to represent. The problem with language from this perspective is that we can never truly understand the reality we're trying to represent. The apple you hold in your mind's eye as you say the word apple is the generic conception of an apple and not the apple itself with all its discolorations, pits, bruises, fibers, asymmetries, and so forth. That's why the signified can only be the concept of what you're trying to represent. The thing itself that you're trying to represent is called a referent, and it is towards the importance of this referent that post-structuralists point. While semiology has become the science by which many structuralist theories proceed, this willful scotoma of the referent, ignoring social and political values and context in order to posit the theory of a universal grammar, is criticized by post-structuralists. But before we move into post-structuralism, let's talk about archetypal criticism. Archetypal criticism is another kind of structuralism, another attempt to scientifize literature, or not literature, but literary criticism, to locate a kind of theory for everything that can explain literature and give it total coherence beyond the fluctuations and changes and values that happen across each culture and through time. Archetypal criticism as a structural theory also looks for a universal structure, which for our class we might call the intertext, or that to which all literature refers or from which all literature comes. We access this intertext through literature's archetypes, which act kind of like today's memes as building blocks of culture. Archetypes are recurring images, characters, plots, themes, and patterns like the hero, the birth, the fall, the resurrection, the garden, the forest, the flood, the seasons, the solstices, the quest, that have become universal, common to all cultures across time and space because they are part of a total form. Thus, each work of literature utilizes various archetypes, reconfigures them into different patterns to tell different particular stories, but always with the same components, the same building blocks, the same archetypes. So in this way, archetypalism is truly formalist, endeavoring to uncover the original form of literature. When you think of the most enduring questions of culture, whether in science or humanities, this is one of the most central and essential questions. From whence did it, we, they, everything come? We've talked before about how pre-modern Western texts answer this question by pointing to God. God is the first cause of all things. Archetypalism asks the same universal question and makes a similar maneuver in delving into the history of literature to discover its alpha and omega, its unified meaning, the intertext. The job of the poet, then, is to reveal these universals, to sculpt away the scrim of historical and cultural biases and differences, to unearth the grammar of literature. Post-structuralists would argue that so-called structures and grammars are limited and limiting, creating problematic reductionisms of reality that are inherently unresolvable within its system. If we could use gerrymandering as a broad spatial metaphor to represent this idea of arbitrarily organizing reality in ways that reify binaries, us versus them, dark versus light, man versus women, etc. structures, as though reality is limited to these binary constructs, then we could say that post-structuralists criticize structuralists for gerrymandering reality and culture, in a sense. Or more precisely, Structuralism creates order, but order implies that some things are right while other things are wrong, privileging specific positions like facts and science, while bemoaning and condemning others like subjectivity and feelings. Structuralism also threatens to erase and efface the voices, cultures, values, and lives in between the binaries, between that which is presumably easily distinguishable as right and that which is presumably easily distinguishable as wrong. So structuralism cannot represent reality in its totality. If life were a pointillist painting, structuralists stand too far back to even see the dots. So post-structuralists argue that a complete coherence of semiology is impossible. Meaning is always changing. Cultural texts do not exist in a vacuum, and every entity and agent is part and parcel of a larger network of cultural practices. Thus, there can be no God, no origin, no unified meaning. Thus, the author is stripped of his power, and the reader is empowered. In fact, reader response theory is post-structuralist, although neither author nor reader can hold total power over the other. It is from post-structuralism that other theories like new historicism arises. While historicism examines how literature fits within an accepted history, new historicism asserts that history was written by the winners. We can't know what happened, and so new historicists ask not what happened, but how literature represents an event and or conditions. For instance, how are certain governmental policies, intellectual concepts, social conditions, and or political platforms supported or critiqued? Or how are traditionally marginalized groups represented, and so forth. So, while post-structuralists take issue with this idea of universalizing structures, postmodernists take issue with the grand narratives of modernity, that there are truths, that there is progress, that power is centralized and figures in institutions of authority. Postmodernism is an aesthetic and state of being, thinking, and feeling of multiplicity, decentralization, repetition, and irony, understanding that there is no right ideology, golden age of history, or heroic leader to which we must return, but rather an opening and an unraveling of our sense of self, identity, truth, and meaning. We've talked about this before in class. Postmodernists no longer look to the corporations, media, education, and men for knowledge and direction. Instead, postmodernists find importance in what we might call non-traditional values and systems. The power of the consumer as opposed to a corporation and producer. The power of the reader as opposed to the author. The influence of the audience upon media, making media a two-way interchange. Postmodernism redefines what makes a family. You could have two dads, one mom, mixed parents, an orphan, no children. It questions what education is for, if we're just brainwashing you as part of the ideological state apparatus. It focuses on global rather than national identity, and it suspects that tradition, history, and culture is not always continuous and progressive, but moves backward, sideways, and forward, sometimes seemingly spontaneously, because postmodernism recognizes how a truly decentered way of experiencing and expressing the world can explode meaning and leave one dizzy and disoriented. Today, we often feel at a loss, not knowing what we're supposed to be doing, and this is a symptom of the postmodern condition. Postmodernism is supposed to be playful just as often as it is supposed to be serious. It's often called the culture of irony, where we put everything in quotation marks and thus we question everything. What is truth? What is reality? What is humanity? And so forth, contradictorily acknowledging the instability of any possible answer.